also are victims of a genocide. And I kind of said that to be provocative, not on the same level and not on the same way, because I think one of the challenges that the Gaya Gehaga face as a people is actually they were victims of a genocide that was very much, maybe the means were different, but the end result and the atrocity was the same. And so because I know that a lot of us are of Jewish origin, I'm just going to draw a few parallels that we're not aware of. So for instance, in Poland, it was very obvious to me that out of 3.3 million Jews, 90% were murdered. That statistic is ominous because 90% of this continent's First Nations died as a direct result of the arrival of the colonialists. Yes, there was murder, there was also death from diseases that were brought, but the result was the end. It was the same. Today, as I wandered around Poland, at best of the millions of Jews that lived there were at best a few thousand. And the reality is, and the unspoken reality is, that of the millions of Gaya Gehaga that should be inhabiting this land, there are several thousand. 20, 30, how many Gaya Gehaga?
Well, within Quebec's borders, I'd estimate 13,000 at Kwasasne, 8,000 Ganawage, and another 2,400 in Ganasadaga. So somewhere around 22,000. We're on that ballpark.
And I think before I pass over the floor, the last thing that was very apparent to me, because I grew up with Yiddish, which was the native language of Polish Jews, and I went back to Poland, and I couldn't find a single Polish native Yiddish speaker there. Mm-hmm. And Gaya Gehaga should be the language spoken by the millions. Gaya Geha should be the language spoken by the millions of Gaya Gehaga that should be inhabiting this land. But the fact that Utsi was about to speak to us, and he's about to speak to us about, again, the past, the present, and the future in English, which is a European language, and it's going to be for two reasons. One of them is that none of us speak Gaya Geha. The other one is that the Gaya Gehaga, most of them have lost their mastery of Gaya Geha, and it's not just a result of the disappearance of the population and the people from the colonialists. There was a very deliberate plan that was devised and that was executed, and that focused on effectively forcibly integrating and taking away from their culture Gaya Gehaga for the purpose of effectively eliminating them as a people, and in so doing, removing any possible legitimate claim for the land that was theirs.
Exactly, and what Dan and I were discussing the comparisons between the Jewish Holocaust and what is actually still, in my view, and many Gaya Gehaga people, an ongoing genocide, an ongoing, policy of trying to remove us as much as they could. And the comparison, we discussed it, like how do you measure that? What scale would you use to measure the Holocaust and the ongoing genocide with First Nations people? Most people don't know this, but according to historical estimates, before first contact, Native people in the Americas numbered at around 90 to 100 million people across the Americas. Today, you'll find about 32 to 35 million. So we're looking at over 50 million just wiped out. Our populations never recovered. The majority of the indigenous people will be found, you'll find, are more down towards in Colombia. In Canada, disease, war, and these policies led to our people having a much lower population. As the non-native population grew, it seemed like ours shrank. But now we're looking at The indigenous population, the young population, is outgrowing the demographic before them, the other generation. Now, they have to start looking at their own way of looking at the world. Their languages are disappearing, their resources are taken away. They have a future that's precarious at best. And you look at the world itself, the world is starting to change. And it's starting to recognize that these kind of acts of genocide did happen. But you see, First Nation genocide is yet to be fully recognized and recognized in its proper context. Like we were discussing a while ago, every suicide, every death in incarceration, every death by disease that wasn't here before is part of that ongoing genocide.
I have a question, because as we sit and we talk about truth and reconciliation,
Yeah.
the focus is really the residential schools.
That's the popular, I guess the popular focus. You have to look at residential schools for what they were. And yes, they were a racist policy that was designed to basically eradicate our identities and assimilate us. Everybody knows that. But there were some horrific moments in those schools, murder, rape, kids disappearing. One estimate was, the government likes to say, oh, it was only about 5,000 kids that we can't account for. Where one estimate says, no, as many as 50,000 had disappeared. Some may have been brought over to Europe and sold to families out there. Others may have been used, I don't even want to imagine what they were used for. So the fact that the world has started to change its recognition, the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights is one example. There was one before that. It was the rights of the indigenous people of the Americas, which the United States, Canada, South America, and parts of the Caribbean. So the mentality is changing. We're starting to look at indigenous people and their ongoing problems and looking at native sovereignty. What does that look like? In today's context, it's going to be difficult to imagine what would that be somewhere 20 years down the line when we don't even have a proper sense of ourselves. The Kanien'kehá:ka, we've been through a lot like most First Nations. Our language, basically non-existent in my community. There's about 65 speakers, and we're trying to revive the language before it's too late. Other First Nations, the language is wiped out. So these are all, I think, very important parts, living, breathing parts of this country's history. Every one that goes out is a part of your own history in this country that's gone out with it. And I stand here as a product of that colonialism. My mother spoke 3 languages fluently, my grandmother as well. My father had lost it because of the Catholic Church. And the fear, the economic fears that if I teach my child that language, they won't be able to find a job and they won't be able to survive in this present reality that we have. We can't hunt, we can't fish, we can't farm, we can't gather the way we used to survive. So adapting to that present reality is very important. We got to save what's left and try to build on it as we move on into the future. And that's the precarious nature of native sovereignty, is how do you express that in the future if there's nothing left?
I have a question. So it relates, it's completing the question before. The day is called Truth and Reconciliation.
Yes.
And I've noticed that the term genocide, whenever it comes up, it's tempered by the term cultural genocide.
Yes.
When a genocide is a destruction of a people,
Yes.
you eliminate them culturally, they're no more.
Yes.
That, I think, meets the practical definition of genocide.
Absolutely.
But also, if you look at the curriculum of the schools in Germany, every one of them teaches the Holocaust, There's no glorification of the Third Reich, and when I've looked through my kids' school books, there's glorification of the early French settlers in the Quebec curriculum, it's very present, and there's no mention of the practical impact any of it had on the First Nations, or even focus on them being the real inhabitants. So there's a lack of truth or genuineness. Why do you think that is?
Well, we got to go back to the very beginning on how this country was founded, and then later on the Indian Act, and how the non-native society viewed themselves and our place in their world, not necessarily the other way around. But there's the truth and reconciliation. Yes, you touched on it. We got to be able to tell the truth about what happened, but we also have to reconcile as Indigenous people in our parts, whatever the reason was. There was a chief called Clarence Louis from the Okanagan Valley that I had met some years ago. Clarence had been in office for around 30 years as the chief of his band. He wrote a book, it was called Res Rules. And I couldn't believe the honesty, the outright, I don't know, he's pointing at these facts about the residential schools. And I couldn't believe he said it. He says back then, he remembers some of the elders talking about how some families, they would drag their kids to the train station, kicking and screaming, so that they could be taken away to residential school. Because, let's face it, alcoholism was a big problem. And there were some people that just wanted to, I hate to use the word like Clarence Louis said, was to get rid of them, like push them out of the way. But it's not necessarily the parents' fault. Again, people are going to be self-righteous and say, well, that's so wrong of them. Okay, where did they get the alcohol? We didn't make alcohol. And today, the drugs, we don't have coca fields. Where does the coke come from? So we have a tendency to look at that not as a symptom of the genocide, but as a flaw in character of some sort. So when you look at the truth, and we have to say it on our side too, admit that we also did certain things, but why did we do it? Okay, the answer, I don't know if we'll ever find it, but reconciliation is going to take decades. People want quick fixes. And I'm so glad you guys are wearing the t-shirts, Every Child Matters. And I recently said on Facebook, well, if that's true, then we got to prove that we believe that. Because we got big social problems, social ills in our community. And I'm only speaking of Ganasadaga right now. I can't speak for the others. But I think it's problematic pretty much everywhere.
When I was doing my work, at one point I had to read every version of the Indian Act from the 1880s when they consolidated it to recently. And one concept that came up, and it was within the context of, I had to read it for the provisions on the schools, and it was all provided for in there, how it would work, and there was the concept of the Indian agent.
Yep.
What was the Indian agent?
Oh, the Indian agent was, that was the ultimate in paternalistic policy where we're too stupid, we're too inferior to take care of our own affairs. We didn't understand our own needs. I don't care what good intentions they say they had at the time, that the Indian must be brought into the present day reality, kicking and screaming if they have to. But along the way, these residential schools, I know there was one in, I think it was in Saskatchewan, actually two. This was just around World War II. They conducted starvation experiments on the children, where one school was given the nutrition they needed while the other was deprived of healthy food, to see what the effects of starvation would be on a child. And that's a reality. You can check that out. It's true. And the Indian Act also at one point had a law in it that said that First Nations were forbidden from owning modern day farming implements. So, and Dan and I discussed this one part, at one point. He was saying, look, this has to be verifiable. But I read it somewhere along the way, that First Nations people were not allowed to have any legal advice whatsoever from any lawyer. If a lawyer would give a First Nation any advice, and this was, I think it was up to 1952 or 1953, that the lawyer could be disbarred and imprisoned for giving such legal advice. So you see how much things have changed today. And that's one of the parts we talk about. Where do you reconcile? Let's start with the law.
I came across the concept of the Indian agent and those provisions because the Indian agent was appointed as the representative of the Crown
Yes.
to oversee, make sure everything was managed. And the Indian agent, in the event that parents, once their child hit the age of 6, refused to seize, to provide their child to be taken away for the education, which had to be Catholic or Protestant. They had a choice. It could be English, I think English or French. Don't quote me on that. Catholic or Protestant was definitely in there. The Indian agent, if the parents refused, could then use means of force to forcibly take away the parents. To take away the kids, and also impose to also impose fines.
Yes, absolutely. The RCMP was used when it was first created. And I remember discussing this with other chiefs, and they remember the stories they were told that the RCMP was there to make sure that the enforcement of treaty, that the honor of the Crown regarding those treaties was respected. But it morphed into a police force that the Crown used against us. And when you look at what we were talking about, the Indian Act, you know, I don't care what the governments are telling you today, that, oh yes, we're gonna dismantle it, we're gonna do this, we're gonna give them a chance to exercise their self-government, their self-determination. And as we were talking about the other day, we should have read the fine print when they said that, because we tried to exercise our self-government, and then when we encounter problems of like elections tampering and such, we have absolutely no recourse. They basically washed their hands. They did not give us any of the resources necessary, our judicial resources that we would have needed to set up our own courts, get our own security, our own policing, whatever that might be. And the same goes with everything else. Economic development, okay, yeah, but you're on your own. You want to be self-determining? Here you go, pay it yourself.
So let me ask you another question. From the perspective of Canadian law, you have a house, right?
Yes.
Do you have the title of ownership to the
No,
lot your house
the
is in?
Crown, actually, the land that we sit on is actually under Her Majesty the Queen. Technically, we do not own the land. The land is in trust with Her Majesty. And this is where we discussed that problematic in law, where, okay, in trust, okay, so a trust does exist. So this is what I was doing in my 10 years, was trying to force the Crown to respect the trust aspect of that relationship. So if everything's put under trust, there must be a trustee. If there's a trustee, there must be a guarantor. And we discovered the Queen is the guarantor, Canadian government is the trustee, we are the beneficiaries. And even one court case where the courts actually agreed that the First Nation has a right to choose its own trustee, sent some ripples throughout some of the system. Because the government doesn't want to say, look, we have large, vast amounts of money. We can't possibly just give that over to the Indians, no way. Because the trust isn't only the lands, it's oceans and fisheries, forest and mining. Those are all under trust. We don't get a dime from taxation like people think, like the government likes you to think. It comes from the royalties of all the natural resources of this country that are put into a national trust, which is divided amongst over 600 bands across the country. And again, that trust is also being used to be leveraged for international loans by the Canadian government, using our money, keeping us poor, while they are taking advantage of those resource dollars and continuing on with their infrastructure.
But if you don't,
But-
oh, sorry.
Yeah.
No, because if you don't have a deed of ownership of the lot that your house is
Yeah.
on, what do you have instead?
Where I come from, it's called an OCA letter. And when you get a piece of land and that you gotta pay, say you buy an acre of land, you must register that with the minister. The minister will send you, it's basically a right of occupation. It's not a right of ownership. So we can't borrow from the bank on that. We can't leverage it in any way. So the banks, since they can't seize the land because of the Indian Act, you're left with, you can't borrow. You can't.
So how do you partake in, let's say you have a $1 million idea, you need to raise capital. I would go to the bank, I would present it, they would require me to give collateral.
Well,
How do you do that?
there's some small pockets of money that are allocated, like the AIF fund, which is the Aboriginal Initiative Fund of Quebec. We get for a period of 3 years was 3.2 million to be used for community economic development. When I was there, we decided that since we weren't ready for community projects, we decided that we were going to open it up to band members. Some band members getting as much as 175,000 to start like a gas station or a garage or some form of business. But again, 175,000 really doesn't take you that far. Now, it's like we need to become non-native citizens to be able to tap into what you would normally enjoy. We were hoping that someday we would have the capital to start a First Nations bank where First Nations could go and borrow from it. If the land must be seized, it should be seized by another First Nation where it could be then again reused for another First Nation to develop and enjoy. So the Indian Act had it, and the Royal Proclamation, along with the Indian Act, had the purpose, or at least the intent, of protecting native lands from colonist development. But it didn't stop it anyway. They still took, in my territory, over 95% of the land promised us is gone. And we're left on this little patch of clay. So reconciliation, try to reconcile that. During my 10 years, I recognized that the non-natives are there on my land. I have to find a way to live in peace, but I want them to recognize, understand who we are, what happened to us, and hopefully come up with a decent partnership that we could reoccupy those parts of the land that were illegally taken from us so that we can tap into the economy. Somehow there has to be a way of give and take for now. The reality, this is what I can't stress enough. There are many people that recognize, that look back and they say, oh, we should go hunting and fishing and we should gather. Well, first of all, most of the land is taken away. The rivers are polluted. There's not enough game to sustain, like in my community, there's 1,500 people. So what do? You really need to accept the present reality you're in and work from there. Using the basic principles of the great law, Kayanarekboa they call it, is the great and good law of the Iroquois, where the rights of children were recognized 1,000 years ago. The rights of women were recognized. Environmental standards were in there.
You told me a very interesting one the other day about there was a cap on the number of children allowed per family.
Yes, the great law does recommend it. Families have only 3 children per family for the simple fact that they recognize that overpopulation would lead to resources drying up and the people starving. So there were those kind of things in there that recognized that we needed to do this and live within the environment that we had. Today, using that same principle is a little more complex when you're looking at just the mass transportation, the complex machinery that's the economy. And how do you address that with those basic fundamental principles of the great law? You know, it's like I said, save what you can and hope for the best, using that to build your foundation for the future. But looking back and wishing and hoping you could go back in time and live a certain way. I think it's self-diluting, I think, but adapting to the modern reality, using those basic principles will only make us stronger. But again, we need a partner at the other side of the table. We need people like you to understand. Because I don't mean to minimize anything when it comes to the Holocaust. And when I say this with all due respect. But you see, my Auschwitz, my Birkenau, my Treblinka is all over this country. It's in every school. It may not have been a physical destruction, really, although that did happen, but not on the scale of the Holocaust. But those camps that the Jewish people were put through, my people, it's a different kind of camp. But it still had the same effect of destroying my people and limiting my population, my language. So how do we reconcile that? Can someone actually openly say that? Can someone in government say that?
I was very curious because when I was in Germany, and you cannot go anywhere in Germany without the Germans reminding you of the atrocities and perspective of what we did was horrible. What type of things do you think need to happen here for there to be and I was able to make peace with Germany because of it, which actually surprised me. What things, and even though you can't ever reverse the genocide, there's certain things you can do. What do you think needs to happen here in order for you to, at a minimum, be able to reconcile the past? What does Canada have to do?
Well, I think
ideally.
Canada itself, I'm not expecting much out of Canada. It's the citizens. We got to go around the governments of Quebec and the government of Canada because their citizens still believe that we're lazy, no good Indians and that we're just sucking off the taxpayers' dollars. And like I mentioned a while ago, we don't take taxpayers' dollars. That's a myth. And here in Quebec, I've had it said to me before, that was a long time ago, those treaties, and you should just get over it. Get over it and adapt, just join in our society. How arrogant and short-sighted that is. But talking to the citizens, I think that's the key because you change the citizens' mindset, you will change for who they vote in the future and will give us the leaders we need to truly reconcile with what happened and what's still going on. So I think the citizens are the ones that really need to be focusing on what they can do. I know that it's difficult. You guys, you're gonna go off, you're gonna have your families, you're gonna have taxes to pay, your families to raise, education, sports, and all that. And there's not much room in your mentality and your mindset to dedicate to this particular thing. But a little bit here, a little bit there, maybe in your education system, teaching the perspective of the First Nation. Those children will grow up with a different mindset. I think that's where a real reconciliation can happen as well.
Can I say something? When my children were on online Zoom, I was one day present and she was teaching them about history and she was teaching them about the Iroquois and how the colonialism started. And one of the children, I was so impressed. I had to stop her and tell her that I was so impressed by him. He said, but Madame, ils étaient ici avant. They were 7 years old. And I called the mother and I told her, I'm impressed by your son to no measure, that he stood up and he told the teacher that in the middle of the school, and I stopped the class and the teacher said, after a few seconds of silence, tu as raison.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. You see the seeds.
It starts slowly, yes.
Absolutely.
And we spoke to the teachers many times that we hate their books.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We go to parents, teachers, and all we tell them, we hate the books that you send to our kids and what you teach them. And they said, but it's not us, we have to follow the curriculum of the government.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I don't know if I've been going on and on. Dan and I, have you any questions? Well, I'm here.
Another point, and this is like to what Leanne is saying, and even for today, I have to tell you, I was personally quite disappointed today because last year when they announced that September 30th was gonna be trust and reconciliation, my children's school was kind of like scurrying, didn't know what to do, didn't know how to handle it. They said it was so short notice. I asked, are they wearing orange t-shirts? They're like, it's delicate for the kindergarten students. So I said, you know what, maybe that's fair. They made it as if they were gonna do the appropriate research and they were gonna really see how to handle it. And then come now, today, this is our second year, and there was nothing. And so I found that quite disappointing. And as a mother of 3, like, it's my responsibility to teach them. So at home, we have those conversations at home, but the importance of that. And I think that we all need to be more vocal, like even with our own schools and our own administration, to make sure that that education shift is happening. Because it's the young kids, you know, and it's still like, I mean, all of us are still open to learn and open to help and what have you, but it takes a lot of dedication, will, and educating people, which is why I think it's so important that you're here today to speak firsthand, to give more context to all of this. Because I think a lot of the other thing too is it's easy, like you said, to go on with your day to day if you haven't been close to it, right?
That's right.
Like it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind situation. So that's why I think it's important for us to talk about it, but once a year is certainly not sufficient. So I don't know if you have any ideas or anybody in particular that you could put us in terms of, you know, even if 2 people from today's, you know, gathering or 3 people take this one step further, how, where do we start, you know, that type of thing.
I want to say something. Dan and I were discussing on the weekend that we're not going to wait for next September 30th to do another gathering. We have 2 more speakers and we were thinking of inviting them in March. So this is our participation. And also, I mean, you have to get to know them. You have to get to know people and invite them. Utsi was at our daughter's bat mitzvah last year, and we invited him to our son's bar mitzvah in a couple of weeks. And many other friends that we have. It's like building, they say it's building those bridges. It's little by little that does a lot. So we can't do on the level of the government, that's for sure. But the little we can do, we will. So, and Dan and I host usually our next Jewish holiday, Sukkot. We have a 7-day open house kind of a thing. We told Leah where we bought the shirts and we want to invite you and Patricia and all our other friends, you're welcome to come one day and sit with us in the sukkah and just talk to us about our tradition and about yours. Little by little, like small gestures.
Absolutely.
Whoever wants to come to our sukkah that day, let me know, you're invited.
Yeah, there's a lot of things you can do. These are like cultural exchanges. We have powwows in the summer. You could try to stroll through a powwow, try talking to people, ask them questions. You see elders sitting there in the shade, enjoying a cold drink. And would you mind if I asked you a question? And starts with that. There are also books. There's one I found particularly very interesting and informative, was one written by, I think his name is Brian Rice. It's called Rote no Shuni. And it gives you the perspective of the Iroquois. We had a man called Tekanawiba at one point. He was sent by the Creator to teach the Iroquois how to live in peace because we were killing each other in mass and terrible things. So he was sent here to teach us how to live in peace, that peace is more powerful than war. So Tekanawiba, and this story sounds familiar, had some followers. He went across Turtle Island and recruiting and talking about that. And he united the Iroquois, 5 nations at the time, under one law, under one principle of peace and a good mind, respect. Anyway, if you read that book, it's going to show you a story of creation. It's going to still show you how the Creator started and his evil brother coming in, always creating havoc and always making trouble and creating monstrosities while the Creator was doing his really good thing. Now, you'll see the principles start coming out on the pages. And later on, there's kind of like a lesson to be learned, because he talks about how the elders of the Haudenosaunee, how these stories, the whole story was passed down generation to generation. You see, the great law takes 3 days to recite from sun up to sundown. It's a long story, it's very detailed. He condensed it in this book, but in the end of the book, he's talking about how the warriors at one point took over from the peace chiefs and the clan mothers. And when the warriors came back, after the lands were gone, they traded a lot for guns and booze, and when they came back, the people were dying of disease and starvation. And the peace chiefs with the clan mothers approached them. They didn't put them down. They just simply, in a calm and gentle voice, told them, you see what war does. You see why peace is more powerful. Look at the people, look at what happened. So we have our own lessons, our own story to tell. Starts with just a simple, you look it up. Information is everywhere. And the outlying areas, as a matter of fact, before I finish here, the Quebec government, we were, as chiefs of Quebec, demanding that the Premier recognize systemic racism within the system after Joyce Echequen's death. And I told the chiefs, again, you're not being realistic. The Premier, if he does such a thing, you're going to have the unions within the healthcare system, possibly within the justice system, are going to come out and they're going to say, look, you're painting us all as racists when you say it's systemic. I would say racism exists and we're going to do our best to eradicate that. But the chiefs kept on asking, demanding, you're never going to get it. The unions here are just too powerful. So to get that message across and that recognition, you got to go about it another way. So, I don't know, is there anything else?
Any other questions, guys? Comments, ladies and gentlemen?
I mean, I heard something. I was listening to a radio broadcast the other day on the CBC about truth and reconciliation, and something really stuck with me. It's really poignant. It's the idea, and perhaps there's different interpretations of the word reconciliation, but it's almost implied that there's two faulty parties. And I wanted to just get your perspective on that and the wording that's used. You know, you could have easily used, something like truth and reparations, but I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
Actually, that's a good point with truth and reparation. But yeah, reconciliation does imply that both parties were wrong and they should reconcile their differences. And like I said a while ago with Clarence Louis, pointing to the fact that some families were actually, they couldn't wait to get rid of their children and send them off to residential schools. These are the type of self-examination that have to be done. What was our part in it? Because with the Mohawks, with the Iroquois, we were the most powerful nations band together on the East Coast. And it was said that the Europeans, the door to conquering North America was through the Iroquois. So friendships, the treaties that were formed with us were those of friendship and neutrality, but none of seceding anything, nothing. That happened only after the whites became more populous than us. That now that they had the population, that they could do what they want, and the further they went, the worse it got. But yeah, you're right. What was our part in that? Why didn't we declare war on them when they started doing this? Well, maybe because they had more guns, more cannons, more threatening to eradicate us. Because at the Treaty of Swagachi, what was it, the Treaty of Ganawage? Where the general, I think it was General Amherst that said, if you become a nuisance, we will punish you. And you know my army, you know I have the guns. So you form a treaty of friendship, and then you threaten your partners in friendship with your cannons. So again, deep and I think honest examination of my part, my ancestors, but I think that's more of an internal thing.
Can I disagree? Because I don't think reconciliation requires acknowledgement of bad on both parts. When I look at the Holocaust, I think there definitely was a movement towards reconciliation between the Germans and the Jews, but I think it was the Germans that had to find a way to reconcile what they did so that there would be acceptance. And I think terming it as truth and compensation misses the point, because it looks like a cash grab. Compensation is definitely a component of reconciliation. But if it's
Absolutely.
just compensation,
Yeah.
reconciliation is more than that.
Of
Because
course it is.
if there's compensation
Yeah.
without an effort to have a true and honest understanding, there is no reconciliation.
Absolutely. And I'll give an example. When I was at the table with the land claims, the government's position was that we are going to compensate you for the loss of use. And I started thinking about that term. And then I realized if I accept your term, loss of use, I'm accepting the fact that the lands that I'm trying to claim back are gone. And they're not gone, they're right there. And we still have the right to occupy those lands wherever possible. So those kind of wordings, the trickery in the back of that. And you're right, reparations doesn't necessarily mean just financial. The reparation could be handing back of lands, the resources that we need to survive. So we gotta be careful on the wording we use when we talk truth and reconciliation and some form of compensation or reparation. Because those damn words are gonna come back and bite you in the rear end and if you're not careful. So, that was a damn good point. And
That's why I'm a lawyer.
yeah. But I had a couple of funny stories though. Along the way, it was this one time we were celebrating the War of 1812, the 200th anniversary back in 2012, my first full year as Grand Chief. So we were invited to a fort by the American border, where Stephen Harper was going to be given a speech. That was so funny. The Prime Minister is standing there all serious and getting right into his speech. And all of a sudden, my phone starts to ring. And my ringer is crickets. I didn't know how to, I had just bought the phone and I didn't know how to shut this damn thing off. And the Prime Minister is trying to act like he's real straight like this. And he's looking at me and I'm going, like, I'm sorry. And the chiefs are giggling in the front. Anyway, I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but soon after our budgets got cut. Anyway, or the other one with the Minister of Justice. Well, one of his high advisors was at a meeting, and we were discussing, good discussion, talking about things. And then when we were done, we were going around the room and shaking hands and really nice meeting. And he looks back and he says, Grand Chief, he says, I noticed, he says, you have a handkerchief around your belt. He says, there any significance to this? And without skipping a beat, I pulled it out and said, yeah, you know what, sir? It's because you just never know. And you should have seen the look on his face. It was amazing. It was amazing. I should have took a picture of that. I still don't know how to handle my phone at the time. Anyway, but stuff like that happens along the way. You get to laugh about it, and hopefully, you walk away a little less stressed and less worried about things. But when I told the NDP about that in Ottawa, with that story with Stephen Harper, they couldn't wait to get back to all their NDP buddies in Ottawa and tell them that story about Stephen Harper and how he was cricketed in the middle of this. Anyhow, you guys are amazing, and I think the future looks a little brighter because of the understanding you're showing us. And I think our two societies will eventually find a way to live in peace and mutual equity. But we can't let go of the effort. It's not just a bandwagon. Some hop on the bandwagon like, Idle No More came up like a storm and then fizzled out. And yeah, missing murdered women, it came up like a storm and then all of a sudden it went. No, we have to keep consistent in what we're doing. Every child matters. I think that's a good one to keep on going. Appreciate it.
So
Thank you so much.
You've done the effort also. Niawa in Gayageha is thank you.
Nyawa is a
Thank
big
you very
fan.
much.
Yeah.
For coming down and agreeing to meet with us and actually making this day meaningful, because had you not been here, it would have been just another day with us simply wearing shirts.
Oh, yeah, you guys have been too kind, and it was really an honor to be able to speak to you and hopefully plant a seed of understanding And I think that's more than what I can hope for.
Thank you
So-
so much.
Thank you for
Thanks, guys.
coming.
Thank you very much, I really appreciate it, you guys are great.
So now do you want to eat?
Yeah, please eat.